In Spain, the decades which led up to 1936 were characterized by political, social, and cultural upheaval. Really, ever since the collapse of the Spanish Empire, the country had been beaten down time and time again by poor circumstance and malgovernance, which rose dramatically in the 19th century as what could best be described as an era of unreliable power, a period which saw invasions, coups, revolutions, restorations, etc., all of which really came to paint an image of a nation in decline, an image which would truly be finalized and made clear to the Spanish following their loss in the Spanish-American War. When your nation's crashing and no one seems to be doing anything to stop it, you of course want to take matters into your own hands, and in Spain that's precisely what occurred. Two major ideological camps emerged at the turn of the century, the Traditionalists and the Socialists, who would later go on to form the core of the Nationalist and the Republican factions of the war. Both the Traditionalists and Socialists would branch off into numerous factions themselves, yet throughout it all seemingly held polarized views as to the direction Spain should take, but one of the core issues had been the role of the Catholic Church. The Traditionalists wanted to establish a society of greater adherence to religious doctrine, which they felt would make the nation stronger, whereas the Socialists wanted to both separate and reduce the role of the Church from Spanish governance and culture because they believed it was holding back progress. And these disputes would become core to a number of early clashes that would erupt in the 30s. In 1931, following an experiment with dictatorship, the Second Spanish Republic had been established and the Spanish king was deposed. The Republic sought to modernize Spain in every manner of the word. Industries were to be developed, unions to be established, reforms to be made, and secularization would begin, as previously stated, much to the displeasure of the majority devout Catholic population, which would again fuel ideological clashes throughout the years and also spell power changing hands from the liberals to the traditionalists around 1933. The Traditionalists essentially undoing all the secular reforms of the liberal Republicans and throwing the pendulum further the other direction, as socialists and anarchists initiated mass strikes and revolts in retaliation. This period saw the rise of the Popular Front, a coalition of various left-wing groups, primarily of the socialist, Marxist, communist, anarchist, and Republican parties. The Popular Front would take back power for the leftists, which triggered even more chaos in the streets. Hardline communists and anarchists felt as though the coalition was diluting their cause and protested the slow pace at which reforms were made, as well as the democratic system which allowed the Traditionalists to simply undo these reforms within a matter of years. The Traditionalists in turn were growing tired of watching their culture erode and feared the total breakup of the country along ideological and cultural lines. The resulting chaos led to the deaths of many right-wing and some left-wing leaders, which ultimately left the right-wingers without a significant representative. The army, which held overwhelming right-wing sympathies, felt as though they would never win an election again because of this, and were now forced to sit back as their home was rapidly redefined by the leftists. Refusing to accept this outcome, the army launched a coup against the current left-wing government, who in response armed various left-wing factions and united them into a loose alliance of anarchists, independence groups, communists, Republicans, and so on, most flying the banner of the Popular Front, but others maintaining their allegiance only to their own faction, thus beginning the Spanish Civil War. In our world, the Nationalists secured a victory thanks to superior weaponry, training, leadership, and allies. The war-torn country had been forced to sit out the Second World War as it had the First, and underwent a number of reforms which strengthened the power of the Catholic Church and traditional practice, granted greater freedom to domestic businesses to implement practices they saw fit, and it also established an economic system based on self-sufficiency, which was perhaps not the best choice for a nation both as devastated and as industrially behind as Spain was. Spain for the next half-century would remain grossly isolated and play a minor role in world events. Today, with democracy mostly revived in the nation, the political polarization between left and right has once again risen, and it seems Spain is still carrying on with its historic status quo. As stated before, the Nationalists held supremacy in a number of fields, including the reliable support of Germany and a leadership which kept together the various factions of the Nationalist Front. The Republicans, in contrast, had the mediocre support of the Soviets and Mexico, as well as suffered from internal disunity. The various factions at times held contrasting goals, which on occasion even led to internal clashes, most notably between the anarchists and Republicans. There was an opportunity for France to get itself involved and greatly support the Republicans, as Prime Minister at the time Léon Blum was a socialist and held hard sympathies to his left-wing comrades, however feared dividing his coalition and being forcibly removed by the pro-right-wing military. But ultimately he ended up being removed from power regardless because the matter left his coalition divided and ultimately deadlocked the government. In this world, let's propose that by some means the Nationalists lose the war. This is a bit of a long shot simply because of how much the Republicans had going against them, but let's try to resolve that in one of two ways. This timeline could either see the Republicans, like Franco, put forward a plan or manifesto to fulfill the desires of their major factions post-war. As I said before, the Republican factions were at constant odds and their goals vastly contrasted. The major thing holding them together was simply a shared animosity of Franco, while Franco himself made great efforts to unite the varying factions of fascism, traditionalism, monarchism, etc. under the banner of nationalism. This time around, the Republicans could do the very same under the banner of socialism. Alternatively, Leon Blum could dam the expense and push for total support of the Republicans, much as he attempted to do during his second brief administration in '38, an action which would surely earn him the ire of Britain, who despite neutrality leaned toward the Nationalists, or rather against what they perceived as the Socialists. Blum feared that his actions could have triggered a military coup, as France wasn't in the most stable of states at the time, and in this timeline, it may just. But we'll get back to that. We could opt for either of these points of divergence, but realistically the effects of one may simply end up triggering the effects of the other. As if French support can muster a victory, the Republicans would need to come together anyhow with the other left factions to decide on Spain's direction or risk a second civil war among the leftists. Vice versa, if an end plan is decided upon early and a victory is drawn, Blum's government wouldn't need to compromise its position and goes on to reign over France, certainly becoming friendly with post-war Spain and implementing more socialist policies, which could in effect trigger a military coup regardless. Essentially, a Republican victory almost always spills into France, unless by some means the socialist factions don't come to power and only the Republicans do. Just to keep things simple, we'll be going with the first option. A better plan for how to divide up and organize Spain is developed by the leftists and grants them greater cohesion, just enough to beat the nationalists. So the Republicans win, the nation is in shambles, but the left-wing coalition now knows where it wants to go and can begin the reconstruction process immediately, drawing upon both financial and labor support from France and the USSR. Major independence groups who pre-war had settled for regional autonomy would, for their efforts, desire total independence, creating the new states of Catalonia in the southeast and the Basque Republic in the northeast. The Basque people were generally in opposition to the left-wing ideas of the Republicans and were themselves highly religious and inclined towards strong centralized government. However, because of the nationalist opposition to Basque independence and a seeming desire to assimilate the region into the general Spanish culture, the Basque population backed the Republicans. Their state would likely adopt a conservative, Catholic, agrarian character. Catalonia, on the other hand, saw a great concentration of anarchists, communist, and socialist unions. The region, though it would likely see regular instability due to internal disagreements, would generally adopt a policy of anarcho-syndicalism, allowing workers total self-management, reducing the role of government to minuscule levels, and creating a decentralized commune of workers' unions similar to the Soviets of the early USSR. The USSR, mind you, with its volunteers still stationed in Spain, would no doubt attempt to influence the whole of Spain and especially Catalonia. Galicia also desired greater autonomy, however its politics remained much in line with that of the Spanish order, and its role in the war was notably passive, and thus it would remain a part of Spain, though as an autonomous province, which was supported by the Republicans, something which would also be seen with Morocco. The remainder of the Spanish state would see the rise of the Popular Front to the seat of power, granting authority not merely to the Republicans but also in large part a legion of socialists, communists, and Marxists. By this point, and since the outbreak of the war, the socialists and communists really held dominance over the party, many of whom held or developed relationships with the Soviets by the end of the war. It would be because of this that they would allow for the Soviets to make of Spain an outpost to operate out of and further spread communist influence into neighboring countries. While religious practice would be suppressed in Spain, violence against churches and clergy would cease in a bid to calm the Catholic populations into cooperation. Private religious practice would continue, much as in the USSR, but officially the nation would adopt a secular character. Much of the radical right-wing parties would be arrested and given show trials, major military leaders seeing execution or imprisonment, while monarchists and pro-religious figures were granted lighter sentences, or released to prevent public outrage. Like under Franco, minor dissidents would be allowed to leave Spain. However, under this new government, landowners who chose to flee would see their property collectivized by the government without compensation. Collectivization overall would not be mandated by the government but would be encouraged via government compensation for the land to all those who remained. Having lost much of the skilled army, the Republicans, or rather now the Socialists, would need to compensate by improving upon the quality of Spanish weapons, again perhaps acquiring some from France and drawing upon financial or industrial support from the USSR, who would certainly want to keep its new ally afloat, creating a relationship similar to what was seen with Cuba years later. The new government would attempt to balance its policies moderately and not drift too far into the radical direction of the Soviet Union, fearing that a proclamation of outright communism would trigger action by the European powers, essentially much for the same reason Franco didn't directly support the Axis. Greater power is granted to workers for the establishment of councils, of which the once owner would now be a member of, and unlike Franco's Spain, the Socialists had not simply planned to isolate themselves for the long term, and did have strong ambitions of spreading their ideology into neighboring Portugal and France once they restabilized, lending any and all support possible to fellow socialist movements, which now brings us to France. The Third French Republic was as much a mess as the Second Spanish Republic was, disorganized, ineffective, and at odds with itself, in an ever more polarized era. The nation had yet to fully escape the throes of the Great Depression and began heavily flirting with socialism, much to the upset of French traditionalists, just like in Spain. In our world, socialist Léon Blum's government fell apart in the span of a month, 3 times. But in this world, because the Republicans are winning, Blum is never put under strain by opposition to his neutrality, allowing him to remain in power. But Blum's government doesn't really matter. Power in France was changing so regularly that current conditions alone give socialist Spain, and to a further extent the Soviet Union, the ability to influence French politics in their favor. Regardless of what transpires in the wake of Spain's ideological shift, France, because of the now tilted balance of socialism in Western Europe, faces a situation which eventually drives it into civil war, likely triggered by the guarantee of protection to Poland, which, when Poland was invaded, would see the military mutiny and refuse to throw lives away at an effort which in no way benefited the French people. It's often taken for granted how close France escaped its own potential civil war, though one might argue it still occurred and was simply masked by Germany's invasion in the whole of World War II, the German collaborators and Pétain's followers representing a nationalist front, while de Gaulle's Free France represented a Republican front, the resemblance being almost uncanny. Without the involvement of France, Britain may just as quickly withdraw its declaration of war, as just as in our world there was an uneventful 8-month period following the declaration in which neither side took major action, leaving what would have been the Second World War to become nothing more than a phony war. A false alarm, as it were. However, at the same time, the French Civil War would have begun. As with the war in Spain, the war in France would become much a proxy war for the fascist and communist powers, Germany using its neighboring proximity to supply in great force the Nationalists, even more so than was seen in Spain, as for Germany, defeat in this proxy war would mean being surrounded by communist powers to the east and west. Surprisingly, the circumstances in Spain and France were actually incredibly similar, almost identical even. Pétain rallied behind him a wide range of right-wing factions, while the Republican coalition was really only united against Pétain and was composed of Republicans, anarchists, communists, you get the picture. France would follow the same course Spain had in our world, with the Republicans being defeated by the Nationalists and a semi-fascist government coming to power. We could argue the French Republicans would have far better chances thanks to neighboring Spain, but just as in the case of Spain, support provided would be fairly subpar, considering the nation was still war-torn and undergoing numerous reforms while paying off war debts. What we're left with is a Spanish socialist republic with big ambitions, but much like the USSR has a long transition period to undergo before it can really claim a spot as a formidable power, though the nation would no doubt attempt to exert its influence early on, again much as the USSR had but with little success. Because of Spanish meddling and the fact a neighboring state had fallen to socialism, the nationalists and anti-communists within France adopt a more defensive character, and just as in Spain and our world, overthrow the old regime to install a nationalist government. Because of the conflict in France and a refusal to act on the declaration of war made on Germany, World War II never happens because Germany has no reason to invade France. Nationalist France joins Germany and Italy in the Anti-Comintern Pact, while Britain, having allowed appeasement to go too far, but now without a direct means of attacking Germany, sits out the conflicts in Europe and instead supports the US against Japan for the sake of protecting India and Australia. Germany no doubt still plans on invading the Soviet Union, but doesn't need to rush the invasion as they had in our world, allowing it to better prepare itself as well as support the efforts and development of its allies, but the Soviets do the very same, pushing through its 5-year plans while supporting the militarization and recuperation of Spain in what would become an arms race between the European powers of communism and fascism. And that is where I'll end this video for now. The US of Z thanks you for watching, support your legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.